I want to start by saying a couple of things about that spectacular reading from Proverbs. So if you thought that the dilemma of women trying to have it all was a new thing, apparently not. In ancient times, the ideal wife, according to this Proverbs chapter, was a merchant and a weaver who actually spun the wool herself, and a house manager of the household and a manager of the goods. I mean, she did it all. So pretty amazing. That chapter is actually an acrostic, so every line starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and so they probably came up with all of those things to fill out the acrostic, right? You had to be all of those things because you had to have a line for each letter of the alphabet. But anyway, I guess that's all I really have to say about that. No, not an expectation, but certainly an interesting reading. So today I wanted to talk with you about the gospel reading and the portion of it where Jesus calls the 12 together. You know, they've been arguing about who's the most important disciple, right? As they're walking along, and Jesus sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." And then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." So this is one of those cases where there's an enormous sociological disconnect, a cultural disconnect between what we're hearing in the scripture and the world that we live in today. Because today we treasure our children and treat them like little princes and princesses appropriately. And, you know, every child in the room is a precious thing. And, of course you would welcome the little children, but in Jesus' time, it was different, okay? And it was different for some really good reasons. It wasn't because they weren't good people or because they didn't love their children. Of course, they loved their children. But it's harder to invest yourself in a child when there's such a high probability that that child won't make it to adulthood. One of the statistics that I read when I was researching this said that a child of 7 years old had as much or greater chance of dying before the age of 10 as living to 10. I mean, they were more likely to die than to live. And so you can see if children are that fragile, if they die, if they get sick or infected or wounded or whatever, if something is going to happen to take that child from you, you kind of want to wait until they get a little older before you invest too much of yourself in them. I think that's the argument that the sociologists were making, that for the reason that children were treated the way that they were treated. It wasn't that they weren't loved, but they weren't held in the same regard that we hold children today because of their potential mortality. So when Jesus puts a small child, it brings a small child into the midst of them and actually puts that child in his lap and puts his arms around the child. It's a very unusual thing. He's basically taking someone who would have been invisible for the most part and brought them to the center. And he doesn't just bring them to the center, but he embraces that child. So I want you to see how remarkable it is that he has done this. It's an unusual thing. It would have really gotten their attention. I was thinking about that this morning and remembering how when I was a kid, people would say seriously at dinner parties and events where there were adults and children present, tell me if you've heard this, children should be seen but not heard, right? We were allowed to be present, but we weren't to make a fuss. We weren't to make ourselves known. And I never felt abused by that. We just behave yourself was basically the message I got from that. But take that and multiply it by 100-fold, and I think you get a sense of how shocking it was for Jesus to take, or at least surprising it was for Jesus to take this child and hold him or her in his lap. So instead of taking the host of the house that they were in and bringing that person to the center, Jesus took someone from the side, from the margins, an invisible person, and brought that child to the center. And so the question I think that it's useful for us to consider today is, who is invisible today? Certainly not our children. We revere them appropriately. I mean, it's wonderful that our children can be fully part of whatever circle they're in. But who is invisible today? There are cases where women are certainly more invisible today.
The one scripture that talks about what women do and what they are, and gave 3 lines to it.
I'm sorry, what? And take what?
And gave 3 lines to it. And now we're completely off that topic. But some of us really needed to hear a message about what wives are and what they do.
Okay. Well, I didn't mean to disrespect women. I just didn't think that was a serious description of what we would expect of a wife.
You trivialize it.
Okay. Well, I guess I did trivialize it, and I apologize for that.
Other invisibles, however.
Other people who are invisible today are the people living in those tents on the edge of the freeways. I used this example, the example of children and whether they're visible or not to us 12 years ago when I was preaching on this same topic. And I looked at who I listed as potentially invisible people in those days. And it was a completely different list than I would have today, because the homeless crisis has become so much bigger a part of our world, the world that we live in today, than it was then. I mean, we didn't have tents under every single freeway. There might have been 1 or 2 around town, visible homeless people, but not like this, not like we have today. Another group of people who manage to be pretty invisible for us are immigrants. We have immigrants. Today we have stories about immigrants from Haiti trying to escape from the earthquake and things are bad in Haiti right now. Yes, Madeline.
The elderly that are in institutions, they're invisible.
And the pandemic, what she said was elderly in institutions. And with the pandemic, we haven't even been able to visit people. The people who could get visits couldn't get visits because they closed the institutions to try and protect people from the virus. So how do we get past this? How do we get past the invisibility of people who are pushed to the margins, the invisibility of the homeless? How do they become people to us?
Try learning their names.
And one of the things, learning their names would be a good start, absolutely. And learning their stories would be the next step. And so what I would like to do, last week I invited you to do a little story sharing exercise where we took 2 minutes each and answered the question to share a time when you have felt loved. And this week I want to do something a little bit different. I've invited a guest, and I'm going to ask him a couple of questions, and he's going to share his story with us. And the guest that I've invited is Dan Cushman. Dan, go ahead and come on forward here. This is Dan and his wife, Mona. Here you go, Dan. I'm going to hand that to you. And I should put my mask on since I'm standing next to you now. So Dan is our head cook. And every Tuesday, actually every Monday, Dan and Mona are here pulling food out to thaw and getting things, prepping things and chopping potatoes and vegetables and things like that, getting things ready so that on Tuesday when the volunteers arrive, we can just make a meal, all right? And Dan has been doing this for several years now.
About 2 years.
About 2 years.
Maybe a little bit more.
Okay. So the question I wanted to ask you, Dan, is how did you end up here cooking?
But that's a good question, because it's an odd question. People do have free time, and they usually spend it the way they want to. And it began for me where a friend needed me at a church to help him cook because he couldn't do it himself, which is the one down at the end of the road, the Westminster Baptist.
Westminster Baptist.
Yes.
Okay.
And I did that for about 2.5 years, and then they had money trouble, and they decided to close it down. Well, I and the chef had always been curious about what you all do here, because we pass it every day, because we were doing 5 days a week there, where you all do this one day here, 1 day a week here. And I decided I got some free time, so I'd come by, meet who's doing this, which was Joseph, and he dragged me around the kitchen, and I could tell he had a lot of people working in the back, but they also needed someone who can handle hot things and heavy things, and I figured, well, yeah, he needs my help. And he says, well, we don't pay anything. And that's fine. I definitely have 1 day a week. Because the truth was I was homeless. I had 7 days a week to do whatever I wanted to do. Homeless for me was just a matter of problem solving and not doing drugs. And me and my wife moved into a different lifestyle that gave us extra time to be with each other and to do things like come here once a week.
Yeah.
and it turned into more than that because as the need would arise, I had the free time.
Excellent.
Yep.
Thank you, Dan. So let me ask another question. Why do you keep coming back and doing all this hard work?
Well, and the reason's twofold. One, I do know in this lifetime I was born into service. And so when I'm truly helping people, I feel fulfilled. It's just a part of a function of who I am. And the other reason is I like people, but I really dislike humans.
Oh, no.
And the truth is, here, when I'm in service, when I am helping, people around you, we all question each other to what we're doing, how we interact with each other, and communicate. But as I'm doing what I'm doing, people start to open up. And I get a chance to see who they are and hear their stories. Uh-huh. And it's hard for people to get to that point, to tell you their stories. I mean, you get that when you make real relationships as friendships, not social butterflying. You get that in, marriages and work and this, that, and the other. And there's something about being in service and the way it lends me to the people that I'm interacting with, that they begin to open up. And sometimes they're a little bit nervous because I know I'm a bit odd. But to have them open up and then start to see and hear the things that you miss, right. I mean, it gives them life. It gives you more reason to keep on helping.
Awesome.
And being there with them, not just the kitchen.
So Dan's being very modest. He loves to hear people's stories, and he's good at listening. And so people do tend to share their stories with Dan while they're working shoulder to shoulder in the kitchen. So when he's not yelling at them for putting the pasta in at the wrong time. No, I'm
sorry
kidding,
about
I'm
that.
kidding. That was just the once. But it really was the wrong time. So
Yeah,
I mean,
it
it's
was,
fair.
yeah.
When Dan and I were talking about this last week, he said, imagine this. Imagine that that you do one of those 23andMe things, like where you send in a genetic sample, and you get back a report, and it says, you have an older brother. And you had no idea that you had an older brother. I mean, can you imagine the curiosity that you would have, the desire to know something about this person? And how could you get to this point in your life and not know that you had this older brother? And what's their story? And gosh, what's your parents' story, right?
Yeah.
All of that, right? That desire to know the story. And so you told me that to illustrate
Right.
how much you just want to know people's stories.
Yeah, and it's not, I want to know them in a way that what they give me, they know they're leaning against me. I want to be supportive.
Okay.
And it's different. You know, it's true. Like the story I told you where to imagine that you had another brother. Don't you want to play catch up? Don't you want to know what's happened in their life? A sister you may have never had, you know. And all of a sudden, as you get to that point, it becomes really interesting. And you become a part of their world. They become a part of yours.
Awesome.
No matter how different you are.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you, Mona. So when you take interest in someone and you listen, you make space for their story and you honor their story, you do get to know them in a new way. You get to see the person that's there. And that's harder to do with the people who are invisible around us. Imagine how hard that would be to do with someone who's sitting at the freeway off-ramp with a sign that says, anything helps, right? And yet, those are people too. We're all children of God. So when we make an effort to meet someone, whether it's a visitor or a longtime member, when we give space and listen to or share our own stories, we're honoring the presence of Christ in them, the sacred in them and the sacred in us. So sharing our stories allows us to see past those differences, past our stereotypes, past our assumptions, our prejudices, our fears, our first impressions, to see the real person. In our baptismal covenant, one of the questions is, will you seek and serve Christ in every person? And sharing our stories is one of the ways that we can do that.